Indie games make up a large portion of the market of games nowadays, but AAA games have bigger marketing teams with bigger budgets and more cutting-edge modern visuals, so they end up usually being way more successful. I mean, they're called AAA games for a reason, right? But just because AAA games more consistently sell more copies with their big marketing budgets and their brand recognition, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're better games. AAA developers are under so much more pressure to make something that sells. It has to make money. So they'll end up being much more traditional ideas for their games. They'll be much more linear and they won't innovate too much as far as gameplay is concerned. Their investors are breathing down their neck trying to make sure they get their money back, so these investors don't want them to take risks. But indie devs usually make games purely out of passion, which is why you'll get some crazy concepts coming out of the indie world a lot of the time. So with all that being said, I'm going to give you 8 games that you probably haven't played that you probably should. These games aren't the most obscure games that I can think of or anything, but they're certainly not these AAA billion-dollar company games that everyone has heard of. So let's start off strong, shall we? If you've ever wondered what happens when The Binding of Isaac and Guitar Hero have a baby, then look no further. Crypt of the Necro Dancer is a rhythm game roguelike where every in-game action has to be done in time with the music. It has all of the trimmings of other roguelikes. You collect items that make you stronger, there's bosses at the end of each floor gets harder and harder as the game progresses, and there's a shopkeeper somewhere on every floor that will sell you shiny goodies. Except in this game, the shopkeeper goes like... It might seem like a gimmick at first, but the rhythm aspect of the game adds such an interesting layer to the genre. There's lots of good roguelikes out there, but some of them can feel a bit samey. They're all really similar to one another. But there's no way that what you experience playing this game is anything like what you can get with any other roguelike. And as most roguelikes tend to be, this game's quite hard. I've personally never actually beat this game because I'm bad at video games. The soundtrack is awesome, it's a great challenge, the art style is really cool, the rhythm mechanic is super satisfying, and I'd definitely recommend it. But if you're not into roguelikes, then maybe 2D platforming is more your style. They Bleed Pixels is a 2D platformer with a gothic horror pixel art aesthetic. It's mostly a 2D platformer, but it also has a really cool and easy to learn combat mechanic. It falls into that classic category of really hard 2D platformers that have been quite popular for a while now. Yet it's not too derivative, it still has its own unique takes on things. My favourite thing about this game is how speedrun friendly it is. It's a 2D platformer with satisfying movement mechanics and zero RNG throughout the entire game, and it has a leaderboard. So as you can imagine, it has quite a lot of speedrun potential. Back in the day, I sat and tried to top the leaderboards on some individual levels, and I got like 4th or 5th place a couple of times, and I loved it, because there's a leaderboard staring you in the face telling you how you compare with the rest of the world. So of course, the first thing I want to do is be better than whoever the hell the guy above me is to prove that I'm the bigger gamer. The combat system is very simplistic, it just uses a single button. But with that single button, you can do all sorts of cool combos flinging the enemies all around, all based on what you do with your analog stick. Which means it's simple enough to understand and do cool stuff with, but it's also not so complex that it detracts from the platforming aspect. And if you're not really interested in the combat, then most of the combat sections are skippable anyway. It harkens back to the classic arcade platformers that made tough 2D games so popular, and I'd say it's definitely worth your time if you like the look of it. If you've been watching for a while, then you've seen me go on and on about this game before, but I'm gonna do it again. Just watch me. Because despite my best efforts, this game is still extremely underrated. This game is kind of a Metroidvania, kind of a survival game, kind of a Souls-like, kind of an adventure game, sometimes it's a horror game. It's kind of hard to pin down what this game actually is that clearly. The core premise is that the world is on a cycle, and at the end of every cycle, a torrential rain will start to fall and it will kill you. So you have to find food and find shelter before the rain comes. And the thing that really makes this game work for me is that the game doesn't really tell you anything. It gives you some basic controls and basic mechanics of the game, and then just sets you off on your own little adventure. There's a Metroidvania style map with a story that you can discover at your own pace, and an interesting death system that affects your ability to go between 2 areas. But the game tells you absolutely none of that. It's all left for you to discover on your own. So when you discover how a specific enemy's AI behaves, or when you find a new area, or you figure out how a certain food source can be accessed, you feel like a genius. It has all these complex interactions between enemies, and all of these interesting mechanics, but they're left for you to discover on your own. This might sound a bit overwhelming to some people, and honestly, maybe it is, but to me, it felt really rewarding. The game doesn't feel like it insults my intelligence by repeatedly popping tutorial tips up onto my screen. It lets me discover it all by myself. This game isn't for everyone. It's definitely an acquired taste. But if anything that I just said about this game sounds good to you, then I would suggest you give it a try, because I think it's genius. This game is by far the most simplistic game on this list. It's an arena survival shooter that gives off a whole lot of classic Doom and Quake vibes. The entire goal of the game is to survive for as long as you can. You have one gun, or gun-hand hybrid thing, that shoots projectiles that have travel time. Hold down left click for a machine gun, tap left click for a shotgun blast. And somehow that's all it takes for the game to be super addictive. My favourite thing about this game is the fact that it's basically a strategy game in disguise. Killing certain enemies drops these crystals, and collecting enough of these crystals upgrades your gun, giving you higher DPS. These crystals are attracted to you, and that's how you pick them up. They get sucked in. But they're only attracted to you when you aren't shooting. So you have to sacrifice damage now for damage later. And that's not where the strategy ends, because this game is all about target priority. This tall pillar thing spawns tons of these skull enemies. These enemies are weak, but in large numbers they'll overwhelm you and take you down. So you want to prioritize these pillars and then the skulls, right? Well, yeah, but there's also these spider things that will suck up your crystals and use them to spawn enemies if you don't kill them fast enough. So killing this pillar might just cause you more problems by giving crystals to the stupid spider over there. And then there's these horned skull things, which are faster than the normal skulls and chase you in a more direct straight line. And there's also these centipedes, which are relatively easy to dodge, but they take up a huge part of the arena, which can limit your options when kiting away from huge clouds of skulls. The trick is analysing what's around you and prioritising the right target for the scenario that you find yourself in. On the surface, it's all about that twitchy aim and fast movement, but as much as all of that is important, the way to get good times is to prioritise the right targets at the right times. And the longer the game goes on, the harder that task becomes. The game starts off like this, but quickly ends up going like, This game is extraordinarily simple, from the gameplay all the way down to the PlayStation 1 style aesthetic, but its simplicity does the game a lot of favours. There's no unnecessary bloat, there's just one arena, one game mode, one gun, that's all you need. The game can have a ton of depth in spite of its simplicity by cleverly designing the game's enemies and mechanics to force the player into making quick decisions on the fly if they want to survive. The depth comes from the enemies and the decision making, not from any guns or arenas or unlocks or anything like that. The game's simplicity is its strength, and if you're into that sort of fast-paced shooter / real-time strategy game combo, then this game should be right up your alley. Slime Rancher might just be the most relaxing game I've ever played. It's a sort of adventure sandbox farming simulator game where you collect a bunch of different creatures for your ranch, and all of those creatures just so happen to be slimes that look like this. Clearly the best game ever made. Slime Rancher also allows you to take the game at any pace you like, and your goal can really be anything, from just collecting all the variants of the slimes to min-maxing the perfect, most efficient ranch possible. You can just sort of do whatever you want. The main premise of the game is that when I feed my slime, he poops out this little crystal called a plort, and I can sell these plorts for money, and use that money to upgrade my ranch. And you can make the big bucks from farming these slimes, and the game revolves around micromanaging your little farm. You can go out and explore the world to find more areas with new slimes, and you can also unlock new areas with your money as the game progresses. There's a story, but it's really not very important. In fact, I didn't pay a single bit of attention to it. I was way too busy looking at the stupid look on the slime's face whenever I fed it a carrot. Hilarious. The other games I've mentioned are quite mechanically intensive. They're games that are on the more difficult side, but Slime Rancher is the game you play when you want to lobotomize yourself and run around caring for the funny amorphous blobs with faces. Risk of Rain 1. Didn't expect that, did you? Risk of Rain 2 is significantly more popular than the first game in the series, and although I do think that Risk of Rain 2 is a more enjoyable and more polished game, I still think that Risk of Rain 1 is worth your time, especially if you're a fan of roguelike games. Risk of Rain 1 is a roguelike with a variety of different stages, enemies, playable characters, and bosses that all make for a super exciting experience. The two things that I think make the second game so good are also present in the first: the interesting item design and the ability to loop your runs. Risk of Rain has a large item pool, and you buy items from these loot chests with money that you earn by killing enemies. But unlike in most roguelikes, there's not really any items that simply read deal more damage or gain more HP. Instead, items have super weird abilities, like a % chance to fire a missile on hit, or gaining 1 permanent maximum health per enemy killed. And that makes the items feel super quirky and unique compared to a lot of other games, and it can make your item builds feel super exciting as the game progresses. The other strength of Risk of Rain is the ability to loop your runs. On the 5th stage, you get a choice. You either go to the final stage and beat the final boss, or you loop your run. If you decide to loop, you get sent back to the first level, but this time all of the enemies have grown in strength to be as close to as powerful as you are. This means that you can just keep playing for as long as you see fit until you die or get bored and go to the last boss. So runs can be extremely chaotic, with enemies literally covering your entire screen. It's glorious. Basically, if you're a fan of roguelikes, and especially if you're a fan of Risk of Rain 2, you will like this game. It isn't an overstatement to say that Risk of Rain 1 is exactly like the second game, but it's in 2D. In Grow Home, you play as a little robot called Bud. Your goal is to climb all the way up into the sky to get to your spaceship. You do this by growing this enormous plant upwards into the sky. You grab onto these little vines and they start to grow in the direction that you point them. The cool part is that you can grow these vines in any direction you want, so you can end up creating these sprawling spirals upwards that are entirely of your own design. The game basically lets you create your own level in which to traverse to the top of the map with. This level of freedom that you don't really realise you have until you start swinging around on the vines is actually really quite cool. You can make this plant enormous. There's these little collectible gems all over the place that give you upgrades that help you get around faster. The game is also incredibly beautiful for a game that uses such simple 3D models. All of the robot's movements are procedurally animated with no fixed animations whatsoever. So when you walk around, you're jiving all over the place, wobbling around. It's hilarious. This game gives you tons of freedom to goober around and do whatever you want, and the game's playtime can largely grow or shrink depending on how much time you want to invest in exploration and getting all of the collectibles. The game isn't all that complicated. You climb around and explore, building yourself a plant-based bridge along the way, but it's a ton of fun. As simplistic as it looks, it can be incredibly beautiful and incredibly fun. Now this is going to be my 3rd video in a month that mentions Outer Wilds, so you know that this game's gotta be good. The more I think about it, the more I think Outer Wilds might be the best game I've ever played in my entire life, which is a really big statement. But I honestly, truly believe that it's true. Never has a single piece of media made me feel so shocked, horrified, curious, and astounded all at the same time as this game has. For anyone who doesn't know, Outer Wilds plops the player in a miniature solar system that they can explore in any order that they want. The game has a very deep and complex story, but instead of learning it in a linear fashion from beginning to middle to end, you instead have to piece the story together yourself. There's no enemies, there's no boss fights, there's no missions, no points, none of that traditional video game stuff. There's just a story that you have to uncover for yourself, piecing the puzzle together one bit at a time until you've got the full story. Your only motivation is your curiosity, your desire to learn about the story, and the game does an incredible job at sparking your curiosity without ever really making you do anything. It never forces your hand. And because it's non-linear and you can go anywhere you want whenever you want, you won't have done everything in the exact same order that I did, so we will have experienced the same story in a different order. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the game, Outer Wilds is the most spoiler-sensitive game in the universe, so I can't really tell you much. All I can really say is that you should go play it. It's an expertly crafted game where the only motivation to play is your own curiosity of the world that you now find yourself in, and the story that is yet to be uncovered, and I cannot recommend going and uncovering it for yourself enough. So that was my list of 8 games that you probably haven't heard of that I think are worth the time and money investment. If any of what I just described to you sounds fun, then you should definitely go give them a try. Because why spend $60 on a fun game when you can spend $15 on a game that's just as fun, if not more fun? Thanks for watching.